Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're taking a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. Abiding love. 40 lessons from 40 years of marriage.
I love this book.
Yeah, and what's cool is this couple, Ibi and Mina Kamonibo, they're sharing, well, it's like a lifetime of wisdom about marriage. And we're all about getting to those juicy insights quickly, right?
Absolutely. Our listeners want the good stuff.
So we're pulling out the most insightful lessons, the stuff that really surprised me, actually, from their 40 years together.
You know, it's funny. They don't start with the usual stuff like communication tips.
Right.
It's more like, hold on, before you even think about I do, let's talk foundation.
I was surprised too, and their own story is anything but ordinary. They built their relationship through letters for years.
Wow, different countries, right?
Yeah, different countries. You have to wonder if that distance actually made them communicate on a deeper level right from the start.
It might have. But what they really emphasize is how important it is to be on the same page about those core values.
You mean like those fundamental beliefs?
Exactly. Life, faith, family, things like that, even before you start thinking about a wedding.
Interesting.
They argue that not being aligned on these things, well, it can be just as damaging as choosing the wrong person entirely.
Whoa, that's a bold statement. You're saying values are just as important as, say, compatibility.
That's exactly what they're saying. And it makes their next point even more interesting. They are really against even mentioning the D word, divorce. They believe that even bringing up that possibility, even hypothetically, it introduces this crack in the foundation of your commitment.
I see what you mean, like even jokingly saying, if we ever get divorced, could plant a seed of doubt.
Right, especially early on.
But is it realistic to never even discuss the possibility? I mean, sometimes things happen, people change.
It's a good point. And to be fair, the book does acknowledge those realities. What they're saying is that just the act of saying the word divorce, even theoretically, it can create fear and uncertainty, which can really damage trust.
Right.
It's almost like you're saying in the back of your mind, well, I've got an escape route.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And, you know, it shifts the focus. It becomes less us against the problem and more me against you.
Even if it's just subconscious, right?
Exactly. And here's where their advice gets really interesting. They talk about friendship.
Oh, like being friends with your spouse.
Yeah. Like really nurturing that friendship as the bedrock of a strong marriage. Just enjoying each other's company, you know?
The simple things.
Exactly. Sharing laughter, being supportive.
They actually have some really relatable stories about this. They talk about those early years, how much they loved just simple things, like walks in the mall, or even macaroni and cheese dinner.
Right. It wasn't about fancy dates or anything like that.
It was about that connection, genuinely enjoying being together.
And what they argue is that this foundation of friendship, it acts like a buffer against the inevitable challenges life throws at you.
Makes sense.
They had their share of difficulties, financial struggles, even infertility. And they believe that having that solid friendship helped them navigate those tough times.
So it's like having a built-in best friend,
Right.
who's also the person you share your life with.
Precisely. It's like building a team.
Right. And strong teams rely on trust and camaraderie, especially to get through tough times.
Exactly. And this leads into their advice on building trust through transparency and vulnerability.
Okay.
They believe in being upfront about weaknesses, insecurities.
It's got to be hard.
Mina actually tells the story about admitting to Ibi that she didn't know much about cooking when she moved to the U.S.
Oh, wow. That's brave.
Right. It's hard to let your guard down like that, especially in a new environment.
Especially in a new environment.
But their point is, those moments of vulnerability, that's what truly builds intimacy.
Makes you feel closer.
Yeah. They also talk about choosing your inner circle wisely.
Oh, interesting.
Surrounding yourselves with friends who support the marriage, not those who bring negativity or drama into the equation.
That's good advice. So we've talked about aligning on values, avoiding the D word, nurturing a deep friendship. What other practical tips do they have for building a strong foundation?
Well, this one was interesting. They're really big on setting what they call guardrails in the marriage.
Guardrails.
Yeah, it's basically like boundaries you put in place proactively to avoid potential problems.
So like preemptive damage control. What kind of guardrails are we talking about here?
Well, they give the example of not riding in a car alone with someone of the opposite sex. It's not about distrusting your partner. It's about taking away the opportunity for temptation or misinterpretation.
I see. So it's about being wise and setting those boundaries up front rather than waiting for something to happen and then reacting.
Exactly.
Prevention over cure, like that.
Now, this next piece of advice is a bit more nuanced. Their stance on sharing marital struggles.
Oh, venting. I've definitely been guilty of oversharing in the past.
Haven't we all?
But isn't it important to have someone to talk to when you're going through a tough time?
They're not saying don't talk to anyone. What they caution against is venting to the wrong people,
Okay.
because it can actually damage the marriage.
How so?
Well, think about it. You share your frustrations with a friend, they're going to get a negative perception of your spouse.
Right.
Even if things get better between you and your partner, that initial impression might stick with your friend.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It could affect how they interact with your spouse in the future.
It's almost like you're inviting outside opinions and judgments into something that's very private, very sacred.
Exactly. And remember, Evie and Mina spent those early years pretty isolated.
No family nearby, right?
Yeah, without family or close friends nearby. They had to rely on each other for support.
I can see how that would make them more careful about who they confided in.
It's like they were forced to develop healthy communication patterns right from the start, out of necessity.
Interesting.
And they talk about using humor to diffuse tension.
Oh, I love that.
Like creating these made-up, kind of silly icebreaker words to lighten the mood when things were getting heated.
That's great. Laughter is the best medicine, isn't it?
Especially in those high-pressure moments. Now their focus on building this strong foundation, it really makes sense when you get to their next big point, accountability and growth within marriage.
Okay.
They believe you're not just accountable to each other, but also to something bigger than yourselves.
To a higher power.
Exactly. You got it.
And so it's about aligning your actions with those spiritual beliefs. I can see how that ties back to their earlier emphasis on those shared values.
It's not just about keeping each other in check. It's about striving to live a life that reflects your faith.
Right.
And they believe this commitment to growth should also extend to supporting each other's individual journeys as well.
Do they give any examples of how this played out in their own lives?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Remember Mina mentioned not being a great cook initially? Well, she ended up mastering American cuisine, with Evie's encouragement, of course, and a Betty Crocker Dinner for Two cookbook.
Ah, that's sweet. It shows how marriage can be a journey of individual growth, too, with the right support.
Now let's talk about intimacy.
Oh, okay.
The book goes beyond the physical side of it, which is interesting considering their background, where sex was considered very taboo before marriage.
That's a big shift. I'm really curious to hear their perspective, given that context. What do they have to say about intimacy within marriage?
They talk about God's plan for intimacy being multifaceted, so it's not just about physical attraction. It's about truly knowing your partner on a much deeper level, emotionally, intellectually, even spiritually.
Wow, that's deeper than I expected.
Right. It's about going beyond the surface.
Creating a space where you can be completely yourselves, sharing vulnerabilities.
And feeling truly seen, understood.
Okay, so far we've covered communication, friendship, trust, growth. What else do they highlight as essential for a thriving marriage?
They dedicate a whole section to laughter, to shared humor.
That's great. They do have some hilarious stories using humor to cope with challenges. It's true, laughter is the best medicine. It brings people closer, helps us process tough emotions. But honestly, sometimes when things get really stressful, laughter feels impossible.
Yeah, I get that.
Do they talk about how to cultivate a sense of humor, even when you're in the thick of it?
That's a great question, and they do touch on it. They actually bring up the concept of the negativity trap.
Oh, interesting.
And how our brains are kind of wired to focus on the negative.
It's so true. Even if 90% of things are going well, I find myself fixating on that 10% that's not working. But I do wonder, isn't a little negativity healthy? To acknowledge the problems so you can work on them.
Absolutely, and they address that too. It's about balance. They explain this concept called negativity bias.
Negativity bias.
Yeah, where our brains naturally give more weight to negative experiences.
Oh, that makes sense.
It means even if things are generally good, we might dwell on that one bad thing. And it can really skew our perception of the whole relationship.
So it's about being aware of that tendency and consciously choosing to focus on the positive.
Without ignoring the areas that need work, of course.
Right.
And they give some really practical tips, like practicing gratitude, focusing on solutions instead of dwelling on the problems.
Okay.
Choosing to speak kindly, even when you're upset.
Those are good reminders.
It's like they're saying negativity is contagious, but so is positivity.
It's about creating a more uplifting environment.
Exactly. And finally, they end this section with a really beautiful and realistic perspective on forgiveness and healing.
Oh, that's important.
They believe that no marriage is perfect. There will be hurts and disappointments along the way.
For sure. But doesn't constantly forgiving someone for their mistakes just enable bad behavior? I mean, where do you draw the line between grace and accountability?
It's a great question. And I think it goes back to their earlier point about personal responsibility. Forgiveness doesn't mean condoning bad behavior. It's about choosing to release that anger and resentment.
So you can move forward.
Exactly. They call it redemptive love.
Redemptive love.
Focusing on forgiveness, healing, restoration.
Okay.
And they actually share a personal story of working through a period of miscommunication and frustration in their own marriage. It really highlights how important grace and empathy are.
So it's not about ignoring the hurt. It's about choosing to let go of the pain and move forward with love.
Precisely. They tie this back to their faith, too, emphasizing that redemptive love is a reflection of God's love for us.
That's powerful stuff.
He forgives us, so we should strive to forgive each other.
It makes you think, doesn't it?